Morning, everybody. Welcome to session 8 of Staying Alive, which is our last session. All right, so I want to start by tying up a few loose ends. We've looked before at certain products and their ingredient lists, and I want to just make a brief mention that some vegan imitation products, like imitation meat and so forth, that you might think are healthy because they're supposed to be imitation meat or whatever, are not that great. So just a couple of examples. Here is Beyond Beef, one of the more popular alternatives today. But if you look at the ingredients, first thing you see up there at the top of the list is canola oil, followed by refined coconut oil, and ultimately cocoa butter, which is oil. So this stuff is just oil. Most fake products, meat substitutes, dairy substitutes, are mostly oil, which is problematic. Here's fake cheese. Again, we have in its ingredient list cashew milk, which is oil, high oil content of the cashew substance, and organic coconut oil. So it's just oil again. So I just caution you to watch out on the ingredient list for the content of these fake products. A lot of them have chemicals as well, so be careful. All right, so I want to give you a little update ultimately on my status, but first a little background on how I check my status. So I have had, from the beginning of this diagnosis 3.5 years ago until today, I've had 12 scans so far, periodic routine checkup scans of 4 different types. I've had 3 CT scans, 3 PET scans, 4 MRIs, and 2 ultrasounds. So let me first explain what a CT scan is. It utilizes tons of X-rays to produce these very detailed images of your internal structures. I don't know how they do it, but they put you in a tube and they run the X-ray machine, and it creates these cross-sectional slices each direction like this, and it's very detailed images. Now, a PET scan is a CT scan that has overlaid on it another image. You got the background images of the structures from the CT scan, but then they inject you with a radioactive dye that is absorbed by tumors. And so the dye will appear as a spot on the scan. So they take the scan that has a spot on it and they overlay it on top of the scan that has the internal structures, and they can tell where the tumors are. They make the structures light up. They give them a color, yellow or green or red, whatever the computer wants. And that's how you identify tumors on a scan. It's a CT scan plus radioactive dye. That's a PET scan. Now, normally in cancer, they use a radioactive glucose as the tracer for the tumors, because cancer tumors have a high metabolism. They use a lot of glucose. And so whenever there's a glucose concentration in an area, you can assume that's a cancerous cell. So they use glucose as the radioactive glucose as a marker in a typical PET scan. But in my case, my cancer is different. Glucose wouldn't show anything. It's a specialized dye that is tuned to be absorbed by hormone producing cells. That's the nature of my tumor. It produces hormones. So the hormone producing cells are what attract the dye. It's called a gallium-68 for whatever that's worth. There's a new one called a copper-64, does the same thing, supposedly better. Haven't had that one yet. But anyway, that's how a PET scan works. Let me show you how it works. So first on the list is a CT scan. This is an image of my body right about here, cross section. And I want to focus your attention on this little spot right there. That is a lymph node. That's the supraclavicular lymph node right about there behind the collarbone. In that CT image, it's identifiable, but it's normal, looks normal. You wouldn't know it's cancerous until you overlay that image with the radioactive dye that is lit up in red color, and it looks like that. So this is the same image, but this one has the overlay of the dye, and so that cancerous tumor in the lymph node shows up as a bright red spot. So if we look at all the scans, we're looking for the bright red spots, or the bright yellow spots, as the case may be, and that's the tumor. Now, let me show you another image of my big tumor. CT image plus the PET scan image. There it is, plain as day. A lot of dye absorbed there. And notice some of the other structures. Liver absorbs some dye because it's a hormone-producing organ. Stomach, spleen, which I have, when I otherwise might not have if I hadn't have been careful with the surgeon. And as far as my liver is concerned, there are tumors in the liver, and they're not very evident on this particular slide, but on some of the other cross sections, the color variations indicate a tumor. The brighter the color, there's a presence of a tumor in that particular spot. And when I looked at all the images of my liver, I counted 11 tumors that I think were significant enough color variations to justify calling it a tumor. All right. Now, considering how conspicuous my big tumor is, I mean, it's visible in the main scan without any color added to it. In fact, when I had my surgery the last time, I had a CT scan. This is before they had this kind of sophisticated technology. There was no dye. They could see the tumor. It was about the size of an egg. It was large enough to see without having to distinguish it with any specialized markers. But considering how big this tumor is and how easy it is to identify and easy it is to measure in size, I don't need a PET scan again, or very many PET scans again over time. This was necessary for diagnostic purposes, but today I monitor it without PET scans. I just have other types of scans to see what its status is, because it's easy to measure, easy to find and easy to measure. And I have been reluctant to use PET scans because they use a lot of X-ray radiation, probably about at least hundreds of times more radiation than a simple chest X-ray. That's just in the radiation dosage of X-rays plus the radiation content of the dye. Who knows what that exposure is? So I was talking to my oncologist after my second PET scan. The first one I did was in the time of the diagnosis, and then the second one was about 7 months later, just to check progress. And then I started realizing this was a lot of excess radiation for no good reason. And so I asked my oncologist, well, can we do something different, like an MRI? So an MRI uses magnetism as its medium for drawing images. There's no X-ray radiation. There is radio frequencies that they use, some kind of radiation, but it's different than X-ray. So it's much safer. The magnetism is pretty much harmless, supposedly, and the radio waves that they use in conjunction with it are somewhat harmless. So I asked the oncologist, let's just do a MRI, and let's just look at the big tumor, because I'm going to assume that all the tumors are going to behave the same. If they're getting better or worse, they're all going to get better or worse. So if we just monitor the big tumor and don't worry about finding the little ones, we know they're there somewhere, but they've already been identified. We just watch the big one. That'll give us a status report. So she said, okay, why not? So my next scan after that was an MRI, and I've had 4 of them altogether. Now, the doctor consented to this and ordered it, but only because I asked for it, only because we talked about it and I kind of urged it. She would have never mentioned it on her own initiative. And there's a lot of things doctors won't mention on their own initiative unless you ask, and you don't know to ask, unless you research on your own or just probe for things, and maybe you'll learn something as you ask. So she did have a couple of objections. First of all, she wanted to use contrast dye along with it. They use contrast dye with MRIs and with CT scans in order to enhance the resolution of the images and to see more detail, especially when it comes to tumor. Let me give you an example of an MRI in which contrast dye was used. This is not me, this is just an internet image. And it made a huge difference in the visibility of a tumor. So on the left, you see a regular ordinary MRI without contrast dye, and then on the right, you can see this brain tumor shows up very clearly. There's some structural change over in that same spot. You can tell there's something strange going on, but until you use the contrast dye, you're not going to really see it very distinctly. And so the contrast dye adds a lot of detail to the images, and it's very helpful for diagnostic purposes if your particular circumstance requires that kind of detail for diagnostic or monitoring purposes. Now, as I said before, in my case, I don't need that kind of detail. I'm just looking at the size of that tumor. It's going to be the same size with or without dye. It's going to be just as visible with or without it. If I just want to measure and monitor the size, I don't need the dye. Now, the dye is a metallic substance, and it's called gadolinium. It's not suitable for the human body. You know, it's a heavy metal that's out there in the environment, but it's not something you would ordinarily ingest or have injected into your veins. And if you ask doctors, they'll say, oh, it's non-toxic, it's no big deal. It dissipates from your body after a short time. But there's always a risk, and there is now proof recently that the stuff does not exit your body completely. There's some residual, especially in the brain, that seems to last for a long time. And when you start researching that particular substance, what you find on the internet is articles by attorneys saying, we will help you sue for gadolinium poisoning after MRI. And I read a report about a woman who had some symptoms of pain in her bones and joints and so forth, which is typical of this kind of toxicity. And they gave her a second MRI to try to diagnose the pain. But it was the first MRI that had given her the pain, and her pain got worse after the second one because of the dye, double dose. So if you ask a doctor about an MRI, they're going to say, yeah, we're going to give you contrast. They're not even going to tell you that they're going to give you contrast. They just do it, even if it's not necessary to be a high-resolution image for your diagnostic purposes. Sometimes it may be, and you may want to consider that risk and do it. But they're just automatically going to assume that you should have the most sophisticated version of the procedure. And they'll just do it. So the second objection my doctor had was that the images, when you compare a PET scan image to an MRI image, the tumor is going to look, all the structures look bigger. The tumor is going to look bigger on that particular modality, even if it's not. And so you're not going to be able to compare any progress because it's going to look bigger even if it's not. I said, well, oh well, so what? Then we'll get another MRI later, and that'll be the apples-to-apples comparison. And so I said, I'm not worried about the scaling difference between the two types of modalities, because that'll work itself out over time. As I get more MRIs, we can compare the MRI to the MRI, apples to apples. So I talked her into it. I told her I didn't want the dye. I argued with her about it. She had to consent to what I wanted. I did the MRI, and here's what it looks like. Look at that detail. Now, you can see the tumor right there in the middle. Do you think I need any better resolution than that with dye? In general, number one, compared to the CT image, it's incredibly more detailed. And second of all, if I'm measuring the size and status of the tumor, it's very visible. Now, it was indeed larger, and I figured out a scaling formula to compare the two. Because there are certain structures in the body that are always the same size, you know, like the size of a vertebrae or the size of my hip joint, my pelvis. So I measured the size of things that are fixed on both types of images, and I discovered what ratio difference there was in the size, and I just applied that ratio to the tumor, and I found that even though it looked bigger, it was actually smaller from the first PET scan to the first MRI. So that was not a problem as far as scaling is concerned. Now, when I scheduled the MRI with the people that you call on the phone to do that, they assume, even without the doctor's information in front of them, or with it in front of them, they assume that I'm going to get contrast. And so they started asking me the questions about allergy to contrast. They said, do you have an allergy to the contrast medium? I said, well, first of all, I'm not getting contrast medium, but second of all, I don't know if I have an allergy to it because I've never had it. She said, well, but I need to know if you have an allergy from it. And I said, I don't know because I've never had it. I could not drill through the wood. And finally she said, well, your chart says you don't have an allergy. I said, that's because I've never had it. This is how it went through the whole thing. And by the way, when you get an MRI with contrast, the order will say with or without contrast. For some strange reason, that's the lingo they use to mean with contrast. You either have it without contrast, or if you're going to get a with contrast MRI, it's called with or without. And she's telling me this, you know, we've got you signed up for a with or without contrast. I said, what does that mean? Is it with or is it without? I was a huge rigmarole to figure that out. But anyway, I got it without. Now the third time I did it, of course the doctor got trained to write the order the right way, except that the third time I did it, she made a mistake and ordered it the wrong way with contrast. So I showed up to the technicians there, and they said, okay, we're going to inject you with the dye. I said, no, we're not having dye. Well, the doctor's order said you are having dye. So we're not having dye. I'm the patient. I'm telling you, I'm not having dye. Every step of the way, there's a glitch. You have a question? Yes.
Do you remember what the ratio was? Is it like a set ratio that you found? For the difference between
off the top of my head, I don't know. No. What the ratio was between MRI images and CT images. Okay, so that's my MRI story. So then I later learned, you know, after having been rather confident of the safety of the MRI technology, which uses magnetism as its primary functionality, I thought, well, is magnetism really that safe after all? Especially these hugely strong magnetic fields that they use in the MRI process. In fact, I talked to the guy, one of the techs, about the machine, because I had a bunch of questions about it. And in the course of our conversation, he brought in a set of keys on a leash, and we stood about 6 feet from the machine. He held it up, and the keys just zoomed toward the machine, and he was holding the leash, and it was just a horizontal leash as the keys were floating in the air in the direction of the machine. That's how strong the magnets were. And the thing wasn't operating. I don't know if it was switched on or if that's the way it is, we even would switch off. But there was a lot of magnetism, a strong field to be that strong, that far away. But as I was learning about magnetism, I have this therapeutic device called a magnetic pulsar. And it's got a little wand with a paddle, looks like, and it's got it generates a magnetic pulse. And I put it on my body, and I'm supposed to kill bad things without harming the good cells. And this thing specifically says there's a north side polarity, north magnetic pole, and a south magnetic pole. And when you use it, you only use it with the north facing you, not the south. Because north magnetic pole is harmless to cells, to normal cells, while south magnetic pole is more risky. And the north is more harmful to the bad cells, the cancer cells, the microbes, but the south is more conducive to them. So you make sure you always use north side polarity. So I asked the technician at the MRI, I said, there's a lot of magnetism here. What's the polarity of the machine? I'm assuming that one end of the machine is south polarity, one end is north. So he looked it up in his particular machine. He said the front end is south, the back end is north. So if I'm going in feet first in the machine, the top half of my body is going to be in the south polarity half of the magnetic field. And that's where the tumor is. That's where all my tumors are, the top half of my body. So I'm getting south magnetic field polarity in an MRI when I'm hearing elsewhere that south is not really that good for you. So I started getting skeptical that maybe I'm done with MRIs for a while. So I thought, what's next? Well, then I thought, well, why not ultrasound? You know, they take ultrasound pictures of babies, and they come out very distinct nowadays. You know how you can see their faces. I thought, why not? Why couldn't I have an ultrasound? I got a big baby in there. We can see its face very clearly. So I called around. I said, you know, could an abdomen ultrasound detect a big tumor? And they said, sure, why not? So I talked to my doctor, my oncologist. I said, next scan, I want to get an ultrasound. She said, well, here we go again. You're changing modalities. The ultrasound images are going to look even bigger than the MRI images, even if the tumor is the same size. I said, number one, so what? She said, it's not going to be a very clear image. I said, doesn't matter. We're not looking for obscure tumors, tiny ones. We're just trying to compare the size of this monster that's visible on any kind of scan, one scan to the other. And I said, you know, to help reduce the scaling problem of comparing one modality to the other, I said, let's do our last MRI and let's do the ultrasound at the same time, within a few days of each other. And then we'll be able to compare apples to apples. That thing is going to be the same size as in a matter of a couple of days from each other. And then we'll know what the scaling is. She said, okay, fine. Again, I had to suggest that possibility. we did it. And here's my first ultrasound image. It's not as clear in terms of the resolution, but it's clear enough. That's measurable. And the ultrasound technician does a measurement on it. And I've had 2 of them now. And that brings me to the point I want to make, which this ultrasound was just, this one may have been the first one, but I just had one last week, my latest one. And then I visited with the oncologist a few days after that recently. My primary tumor has stayed the same in size for about 2 years now. In the first year or so, it shrunk a little bit, about 15% in diameter. And then since that time, that main tumor has stayed the same size, not growing larger, not shrinking. Now that is good news in the sense that these types of tumors for this particular disease, they never do that. They never shrink and they never stay the same size. They only slowly grow over time. And it's been 3.5 years. If it was going to grow, it'd be measurable by now. Easy. So it's good that it's not growing. I have arrested this disease with this protocol. And if this thing stays the same the rest of my life and doesn't grow, I wouldn't really think that's the most optimal thing, but it'll work. The disease isn't going to kill me. I've stopped it. Meanwhile, based on the 3 PET scans I've had over time, my smaller tumors are all diminishing steadily. They're not doing like this. I said earlier that my first assumption was that all the tumors are behaving the same. Well, they're not, which is kind of weird, but that's unique to this disease, I think. But anyway, the point is the rest of them are disappearing. And there's going to come a day very soon when this is my only one. And I'll be 5-10 years backtrack in the timeline of my disease, which is unprecedented. Without medication, just with these concepts we've been talking about.
You're talking about like half of them.
The last PET scan I had was a year ago, and out of the 35 original tumors that I counted on my first scan, I could only find 17 remaining, and the rest of them were significantly diminished in brightness and size, you know, when you look at those lit up images. So they're on the way out. And I had pain in a couple of spots, one in my ribs, one in my pelvis, that I didn't know were cancer, but there are tumors in those spots, or there were. And within 3 months on this plan, that pain went away. So I can tell right now that without that pain, those tumors are they're not advancing. They're only regressing. So this particular disease, it's the secondary tumors, those metastases, those small ones that are really the ones that are aggressive and that invade your liver and kill you. That's how you die from this particular disease. It's those smaller tumors that get you. This guy is not really going to get you. Supposedly he's the source of all the others, but if he's not producing new ones, and he's just sitting there doing nothing, besides producing hormones, which is another question, but the point is, that's not going to kill me. That's a benign tumor. Benign tumor. If I didn't have any metastases, they'd call it a benign tumor. So in some sense, it's a benign tumor. Now, I'm not sure there is such a thing as a benign tumor in the whole world of tumors. But anyway, the disease is regressing.
I don't think they call it benign though, even without metastases.
They do. Before the metastases, they call it benign. Now, throughout this process, there came a point where I decided I wanted to have a second opinion. From a more, I guess, prestigious expert on 2 fronts. Number one, surgery, to find out if I really could remove that, because my first surgeon said, nah, it's too many problems, too many risks and complications, and the risks outweigh the benefits. But I wanted a second opinion on the surgical question, and I wanted a second opinion on the oncology question. So I found some very expert doctors to consult with at a more prestigious organization. And I talked to a surgeon, and he said, well, I need to do a CT scan of your tumor to evaluate the surgical issues. He said, the images you have so far, they're not good enough for my purposes. He said, because there's possibility that because of that location of the tumor, there's other structures that it could be enveloping, you know, there's blood vessels and so forth. He was concerned about the blood vessels, the arteries, the veins in the vicinity, because there's some major ones there, and the ureters, which are in the same neighborhood. And he said, I need to know those are not involved in the tumor before I can even consider this. So he ordered a CT scan. And CT scans can also happen with contrast dye. Again, you may or may not need it depending on the circumstances, and the stuff is made particularly of iodine compounds, because iodine absorbs X-ray radiation, which creates a shadow on the CT images and gives you better resolution. Now I'm going to show you a comparison of my CT scans. One of them is the PET scan image that has no dye on the overlaid on it. And then the other one is the CT scan that this doctor ordered with contrast dye. And right off the bat, you can tell there's quite a bit of difference in the resolution. These images are much sharper. Now, the reason why he did it with contrast is not because he wanted necessarily the sharpness of these images in particular, but because he wanted to check the those three things I mentioned, the veins, the arteries, and the ureters. So what he did was, as a specialist in his field, he created his own protocol for the use of a CT scan with dye to do his surgical evaluation. So they inject you with the dye, and it travels through your bloodstream, and he knows at what point in time after the injection the dye will be in the arteries. And he'll take a picture at that time. Then he'll wait a few minutes until the dye reaches the veins. Those are the ones exiting the cells, or exiting the organs. And then those veins will light up on the scan with the dye in it. And take a picture of that. You can see the veins. And then the third phase is, after several minutes, the dye will go through the kidneys and exit through the ureters down to the bladder. And when they're in the ureter, the dye is in the ureters, you take a picture of that. You get a good picture of the ureters. So he created this protocol to be done exactly according to a certain plan to get these images. And he said, I have my own clinic do it because nobody else does it. It's my own protocol. Nobody else can be trusted to do it right. So I said, well, I'm not sure if my insurance will pay for this outside, because they had approved me to go to him as an outside doctor. I'm not sure whether they would approve the outside lab to do this. But I made the application and I insisted that it be done by him, and they wouldn't do it. My insurance company wanted to do my main clinic. So I argued with them. I said, this is a special case. You can't do it because you don't know the protocol. So we argued over a couple days, and they said, oh no, we've received the protocol. We know how to do it. We can just follow the directions and do it. So let me just show you what the result was. Out of the three targets, the artery picture, the vein picture, and the ureter picture, we got 2 out of 3. They didn't do it right. They missed the vein picture. So we got the artery picture and we got the ureter picture. I'll show you the ureter picture. Looks like that. There's the dye coming out of the kidney, down the ureter to the bladder. It's exactly what the doctor wanted on this image. Now, when you go to the doctor's office and you look at the charts, of the anatomical charts on the wall, you see straight lines of these tubes. You see symmetry. You see straight lines on the spine. Your body's not really like the images on the doctor's wall. Everything is goofy and lopsided and non-symmetrical. I mean, look how beautifully straight my spine is. I talked to the chiropractor about that. He says, yeah, that's how you are. Tough luck, you know. We do what we can, but that's how you are. That's your new normal. So I got the benefit of 2 out of 3 targets on that thing, and that ultimately was sufficient for the doctor to determine that the surgery was too risky. We're not doing surgery at this point in time. So that's another glitch I had to deal with. Now, my other specialist that I went to see as a second opinion, he was an expert oncologist. He recommended a PET scan. He said, I want to see your progress, and I want to do it on the most latest technology PET scan. It's called a copper 64. And I thought to myself, I don't know why I want to do that. It's just more radiation for the sake of curiosity. Yeah, it'd be nice to see. He said, oh, it might be more sensitive and it will detect better the presence of other tumors you hadn't seen before. I thought to myself, well, my tumors are receding anyway. What do I care if there's 2 more, 3 more, 10 more? They're all receding anyway. He also said, I want you to do a brain MRI with contrast. And he didn't really explain why, except it was kind of self-evident that he wants to check the brain for tumors, just in case. And I thought, well, first of all, why wouldn't that show up in a PET scan? And second of all, why would I want to have MRI contrast? And thirdly, what difference does it make? Suppose I do have a brain tumor. It's diminishing like the rest of mine. But then I was talking to my oncologist just the other day about this, and I said, yeah, that other doctor wanted to do an MRI of the brain with a contrast, and she said, why was that? I said, he didn't say, but I'm assuming it's because you get a better image of the brain with an MRI than you do with a PET scan. She said, oh yeah, that's true, because the blood-brain barrier in the brain will not allow the dye to get into the tumors. You won't tell if there's a tumor on a PET scan. You got to use an MRI with contrast. And they do MRIs in all kinds of situations where there's cancer, because even when they use glucose as the radioactive medium for a PET scan, the opposite is true. The brain takes up a lot of glucose, and so you can't really see much in the brain scan of a PET scan, of a glucose scan, because the whole thing lights up. So they use MRI with contrast, like that image I showed you, to do a brain scan. In my case, I don't think it's necessary. I didn't do it. I don't want to do what's just convenient or a luxury in the medical paradigm. And doctors will order the luxury tests. Sometimes they don't order the right test. Sometimes they're too quick to order tests. That you don't necessarily need all that luxury, or you don't need to satisfy that particular curiosity, or it's not necessary to get the result you want. So doctors know, they mean well, and they know certain things that are correct or necessary, but they know what they are taught. They know only what they are taught, or what limited amount they learn beyond that they go and independently research, which most doctors don't. Now, they have to keep up on their continuing education, and they like to do their own reading of the latest things in their field, but they're reading and researching in the same paradigm that they started in. It takes somebody with more initiative or some reason to go outside that paradigm to research beyond that. And if they do, they'll find things, but most don't take that initiative, and so they are limited in the paradigm that they're in. And there are things they don't know that they need to know, and there are things that they've been taught in their paradigm that are just not accurate, or that are drug-focused and symptom-focused, not cause-focused, and not optimization of natural health and healing-focused. Because your body has an extraordinary ability to be healthy when it's treated right, and to heal when it's treated right, and doctors don't maximize that concept. They focus on identifying symptoms and treating symptoms. And the treatment modalities are typically drugs that can only, at best, alleviate symptoms. Now, some drugs do cure diseases, and when you need them, you need them. Or they treat symptoms that you have to treat because you need the relief. And I'm taking some drugs that I need to take for relief of symptoms, but it's not curing my disease. Now, I'm going to give you a little background. I'm going to show you a short video about why the medical world is so misguided. And of course, it's based on what they're taught. Why are the medical schools teaching what they're teaching? Was there a time when it was different? And what changed? So here's a video about that subject.
The takeover of the medical industry was accomplished by the takeover of the medical schools. Well, the people that we're talking about, Rockefeller and Carnegie in particular, came to the picture and said, we will put up money. They offered tremendous amounts of money to the schools that would agree to cooperate with them. The donors said to the schools, we're giving you all this money. Now, would it be too much to ask if we could put some of our people on your board of directors to see that our money is being spent wisely? Almost overnight, all of the major universities received large grants from these sources and also accepted 1, 2, or 3 of these people that I mentioned on their board of directors, and the schools literally were taken over by the financial interests that put up the money. Now, what happened as a result of that is that the schools did receive an infusion of money. They were able to build new buildings. They were able to add expensive equipment to their laboratories. They were able to hire top-notch teachers. But at the same time as doing that, they skewed the whole thing in the direction of pharmaceutical drugs. That was the efficiency in philanthropy. The doctors from that point forward in history would be taught pharmaceutical drugs. All of the great teaching institutions in America were captured by the pharmaceutical interests in this fashion. And it's amazing how little money it really took to do it.
Surgery became viable with anesthesia and infection control, and doctors advocated expensive, radical operations. These in turn produced the need for a large, lucrative hospital system. Radium fever swept medicine. The price of radium rose 1,000% almost overnight. Another costly technological industry entered the hospital system. A drug industry grew out of the booming patent medicine business. The doctors changed educational standards and licensing regulations to exclude the empirics. Soon, only AMA-approved doctors could legally practice medicine. In a brief 20 years, the AMA came to dominate medical practice. Organized Medicine launched a media campaign to associate the empirics with quacks. The code word for competition was quackery.
So now, the average doctor goes through school, he gets a great education, he has to be really smart to get through it, he learns all about drugs, he doesn't know too much about basic nutrition. I found that the average wife of these physicians knows more about nutrition than he does, but they sure know their drugs. And if you go to your typical doctor today, I don't care what it is, chances are you're going to walk out of there with a prescription. Why? Because that's what he has been trained to do.
When official medicine finally managed to gain the upper hand on the so-called empirical doctors, who cured patients with herbs and natural remedies.
In the 1800s, society sanctioned both approaches to healing. Patients had a choice of using either doctors, called allopaths, or natural healers, called empirics or homeopaths. The two groups waged a bitter philosophical debate. The allopathic doctors called their approach heroic medicine. They believed the physician must aggressively drive disease from the body. They based their practice on what they considered scientific theory. The allopaths used three main techniques. They bled the body to drain out the bad humors. They gave huge doses of toxic minerals like mercury and lead to displace the original disease. They also used surgery, but it was a brutal procedure before anesthesia and infection control. Few patients were willing to have surgery. Most patients feared allopathic methods altogether. Satirists of the day remarked that with allopathic treatment, the patient died of the cure. Competing with the doctors were the empiric healers. Contrary to the doctors, they believed in stimulating the body's own defenses to heal itself. Instead of poisonous minerals, they used vegetable products and non-toxic substances in small quantities. They especially favored herbs learned from Native American and old European traditions. The empirics said they based their remedies not on theory, but on observation and experience. Satirists of the day added that with empiric treatment, the patient died of the disease, not the cure. And the balance of medical power remained equal until the turn of the century. Then, new medical treatments emerged that were potentially very profitable. The AMA joined with strong financial forces to transform medicine into an industry. The fortunes of Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller financed surgery, radiation, and synthetic drugs. They were to become the economic foundations of the new medical economy.
Okay, so I can talk about the hazards of the medical academia, the drug companies, the insurance companies, and the government all day long. That's another 8-week study or 80-week study. The list of nonsense and misguidedness is just limitless. All right, so I've handed out what I call my health improvement chart, and I'm going to kind of summarize the details of it. And what it does, what it shows, is my own sort of summary of my personal protocol. So I'm going to look at the top of the list and just go down it and explain some things. First of all, the chart is divided into 3 columns, level 1, level 2, and level 3. And I say at the top of the list that you can choose a higher level for better health and to lose more weight. But in all cases, I prefer organic foods. And what I'm saying is that as I've been talking about this regimen throughout this series, I said you can do it to whatever degree you wish, to whatever degree you want to get a benefit. So level 1 would be what I consider to be the minimum level to do it at. Avoiding certain things, you know. Level 2 is avoid those things even more to get a bigger benefit. And level 3 is eliminate those things to get the best benefit. Now, I'm on level 3 because I have a therapeutic need, and I'm going to stay there for the rest of my life. And you can choose what level you want to be on, but again, the principle is the more you do it, the more strict you do it, the better benefits you get. And you may not get enough benefit without doing it strict. So you got to make up your own mind what you want to do to get the most benefit. So when it comes to sugar, which includes other names for sugar like corn syrup or cane, there's something they call dehydrated cane juice, which is just sugar. So be careful of deceptive labels. Avoid foods with added sugar. That's level 1. Or level 2 is avoid them even more. Level 3 is eliminate foods without added sugar. Same goes for white flour. It's got various names in rich flour or wheat flour. It's the processed stuff without the fiber. So level 1 is reduce the proportion. Just in general, just reduce the proportion. Level 2 is switch to a whole wheat, which is basically a mixture of the white flour and whole grain. The strictest level, level 3, is eliminate processed grains altogether. Just prefer the whole grains only. And then when it comes to fat and oil, particularly the processed oils like corn oil, canola oil, and so forth, and including high-fat foods like nuts and seeds, coconuts, avocados, olives, level 1 is just reduce. And ideally, eliminate those processed oils. Level 2, avoid even more. And level 3, eliminate them altogether. Same goes for milk and dairy, which is also a fat and oil issue. Same goes for meat and eggs and fish, the whole meat animal products category. Now, people eat meat every day, almost every meal. We eat like kings and queens, which is not the normal human diet. So if you could reduce your total meat intake to 25% of your total calories, that'd be a huge change. That'd be level 1, I would guess. And if you reduced it even more to 15 or 20% of your total calories, that'd be even better. And then if you ultimately reduce it to 5 or 10% or 0, that would be the most strict. If you do go to 0, you should take a vitamin B12 supplement. Vegetables, fruits, and so forth, increase all the way up to 100%, depending on which level you want to go to. Chemicals, reduce, avoid, or eliminate. Chemicals in personal care products, the shampoo, the soap, the antiperspirants, the sunscreens. Avoid that stuff. Reduce it, avoid it, or eliminate it. Now let me talk about water, something I haven't talked about before. The water coming out of your tap has pollutants in it. It's better to use filtered water or bottled water for drinking. And you could start there at level 1, reducing the amount of non-filtered or non-bottled, just prefer that variety. You could up that to use nothing but filtered or bottled water for drinking or cooking. Or you could go to my level 3, which is to get the best filter of all, which is called Berkey, B-E-R-K-E-Y. If you go to Berkey.com, you can read all about it. They have the best filters. That's what we use at home. Okay, salt. We talked a little bit about that. The problem with salt is refined salt is unhealthy. It doesn't have the right mineral balance. If you use unrefined salt, true sea salt, with its full balance of minerals, it's okay. I mean, you still want to be careful not to use a ton of it. But real salt has color. It's going to be gray Celtic salt. It's going to be pink Himalayan salt or pink mine salt. And those are better. Now let me say something I haven't said before, and that's about supplements. I take a ton of supplements for therapeutic reasons. But in general, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think a lot of supplements are necessary. Again, it's for a particular need you may have, but in general, I would say that I would recommend anti-inflammatories as the basic supplement thing that you do. And add a couple of things that are specific. Vitamin D, because a lot of people are deficient, and vitamin C. And you can never get too much vitamin C. Well, it's hard to get too much vitamin C. It's very good for you. You have a question?
What type of vitamin C specifically?
So there are 3 types that I use, and I combine them. One is ascorbic acid. That's the typical vitamin C you see. It comes in powdered form. You can take a bunch of that, but it's going to cause diarrhea if you take a lot. In fact, you ought to take as much as you can and test to hit your limit of bowel tolerance, and then you'll know how much of it you can take. So to avoid that particular problem, I use also with it a combined sodium ascorbate. I mix those half and half in a blend of powder that I put in my juice and so forth. And then I also add another kind of version of it. It's called liposomal C. It's got a little fatty compound wrapped around the molecule, and that helps it get into the cell because the cell membrane is very open to fat-soluble molecules. And so that helps the vitamin C get into the cells, and you can get a lot more bang for the buck. And I use all 3 varieties. Now, if you buy a vitamin C pill, you're wasting your time. There's just not very much in there. And there's probably a lot of sugar in it anyway. So I just use the powders that are just pure vitamin C. Now, you can't get liposomal in a powder. You can get it in a pill, and I actually open the pill and mix that powder with my others. You can also get it as a liquid. That's the exception to the pill rule on vitamin C. I also recommend vegetable juice. Again, it's sort of an additional layer of prevention and health promotion and therapy if you need it. The more vegetable juice, the better. So level 1 is add some to your diet. Level 2 is add more. Level 3 is add even more. You can never have too much vegetable juice, particularly carrot juice. Celery juice is good, greens, all kinds of veggies. I even buy that V8 stuff low sodium, which is okay. The other thing I recommend is something I haven't talked about, fasting. Fasting triggers your body to go into survival mode. First of all, it gives your digestive system a rest. Secondly, the survival mode, your body starts to repair itself, starts to get rid of cells it doesn't need, starts to recycle them for energy, and there's a lot of healing that goes along with fasting. So I recommend fasting. That's a whole other subject. But you could start out by eating in an 8-hour window per day and fast for the rest of the day. You'll get benefit from that. You could then move up to 24-hour fast, drinking water only for 24 hours. Single day fast. Do that periodically. What I do on level 3, I do periodic multi-day fasts, water only, for anywhere from 3 to 6 days. If you're going to do a long fast, you should consider medical supervision. In fact, there are clinics that do that. But I do a 3 to 6 day fast. You do it as long as you feel good, and you'll get benefit out of it. Now let me talk about recipes briefly. I haven't talked about it much here because, frankly, personally, I don't use them. I've done some research to find them, and there's a million of them out there. I just stick to the basics, and I'll get around to more recipes when I get around to it. But for this particular class, here's my recommendations for recipes, because I don't know very much about it. Just go out and search for vegan or vegetarian recipes or plant-based recipes, but with this caveat: be careful about the ingredients we've been talking about. So you could use this health improvement chart as a filter for analyzing whatever recipes you come to, because a lot of them do have oil added, or other things that you wouldn't necessarily have on the best approach that we've been talking about. So I would say, do your own research, find all kinds of stuff, read books on it, but filter it through the knowledge we've been talking about. And particularly this health improvement chart could be a handy resource to use as your filter for those ingredients. So now, in conclusion, everything we've been talking about, this whole diet regimen, this whole lifestyle regimen, some people do this kind of thing for ideological reasons. They care about the animals and they care about the environment, or they do it for environmental reasons or for emotional reasons. makes them think they're a better person or feel good about these things, not so guilty or something like that. For me, none of those things are relevant. For me, it's a practical choice. It's a therapeutic choice. My goal is simply optimal health and healing. Period. Now, I'm not in favor of animal cruelty. I'm not in favor of environmental pollution. And I do recognize there are serious issues out there in those categories. But I'm certainly not doing this as an attempt to be virtuous. If you're looking for virtue, people jump on bandwagons in search of what I call phony virtue. And if you jump on a vegan or plant-based diet bandwagon to make yourself a better person, you will not be a better person. You'll be in better health. But there's no better morality in being on any particular bandwagon. The only way you're going to improve your morality, your true virtue, the only bandwagon to be on is a true relationship with God. And if you have that, you lose interest in all other substitute bandwagons. You don't follow things that ultimately become superstitions. Jesus put it this way. Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. And it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. Now everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell. And great was its fall. So when you have a useful truth, Jesus is talking about spiritual truth for salvation. Believe in Him, receive forgiveness of your sins, go to heaven, follow Him. If you hear that and don't do it, you're misguided. You're depending on something that can't save you. Similarly, whatever the truth is, if you see it and hear it, but you think, oh, that's too hard, that's too inconvenient, I'm not sure. If you don't apply it, if you go on without it, or if you use some substitute thinking you're going to get the same benefit, it doesn't work. And it may seem like it's going to work for a while. You can build that house on the sand and everything is fine for a while. But eventually, the storm does come. Eventually a crisis occurs. The crisis is coming. And you have to be prepared in advance to be able to withstand it. That's true spiritually. That's true for any subject where truth is at stake. So in conclusion, let me just leave you with this. This is 3 John chapter 1, verse 2. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. So I want you to be in good health, but I want you to be in spiritually better health. I care about all that. In fact, I care about the spiritual more. But I see the parallel. The principles are similar in terms of following through with what you know is good. It's always good to follow through on what you know is good.